The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds the same way it had for 37 years, cutting golden strips across the oak table where Caroline and I used to share our coffee. I sat alone now, same chair, same blue ceramic mug, the one with the tiny chip on the handle that she'd refused to throw away. "It gives it character," she'd say, running her thumb over the imperfection the way she did with everything broken that still had use left in it. I wrapped my fingers around the warm porcelain and looked out at the backyard. The maple tree we'd planted for Ethan's 5th birthday cast long shadows across the deck Caroline had sketched out on a napkin 23 years ago. She'd been right about the placement, like she was about most things. Come October, those leaves would turn the color of burnished copper, and the light would dance differently through our kitchen window. Our kitchen. I still thought of it that way, even though Caroline had been gone 3 years now. Some habits die harder than others. The house felt too big for one person these days. 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, a living room that echoed when I walked through it in my slippers. But it wasn't just the space that felt empty. It was the silence where her voice used to fill the corners, humming while she cooked, calling my name from upstairs when she couldn't find her reading glasses. I'd kept everything exactly as she'd left it. Her coffee cup still sat in the cabinet, waiting. Her books marked with paper scraps still lined the shelf by her reading chair. Even her perfume bottle sat on the dresser upstairs, though the scent had faded to something more memory than fragrance. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times. In another life, Caroline would already be dressed and making her list for the day, checking the calendar she kept by the phone, reminding me about dinner plans or doctor appointments. Now I made my own lists, shorter ones: hardware store, oil change, call Ethan. That last item had been on the list for weeks, unmarked. We talked, but not the way we used to. Not since the funeral, really. Something had shifted between us when we lowered Caroline's casket into the ground. The easy conversations dried up, replaced by the kind of careful politeness you use with acquaintances. I understood grief made people distant. What I didn't understand was how distance could turn into something colder. The coffee had gone lukewarm while I'd been staring out the window. I drained the cup anyway and rinsed it in the sink, following the same morning ritual I'd developed since retiring from the construction business 5 years ago. Shower, shave, breakfast, coffee. Order in a life that sometimes felt like it was coming apart at the seams. The phone rang just as I was heading to the garage. I almost let it go to the machine. Most calls these days were from people wanting to sell me something I didn't need, but the caller ID showed Ethan's name. "Morning, son." "Hey, Dad." His voice carried that particular tone he used when he wanted something. Not demanding exactly, but carefully casual. "How are you doing?" "Same as always. You?" "Good, good. Listen, Madison and I have been talking, and we've got some exciting news to share. Can we come over this weekend? Maybe Sunday afternoon?" Madison was Ethan's wife, a perfectly pleasant woman who worked in marketing and had opinions about everything from coffee brands to vacation destinations. She'd been polite to Caroline and me during the courtship, warmer during the engagement, and progressively cooler after the wedding. Caroline had noticed it first, the way Madison would steer conversations away from family history, the slight frown when Ethan mentioned spending weekends at our house. "Of course," I said. "I'll make that roast you like." Actually, we were hoping to bring Madison's parents along, Gerald and Patricia. They're visiting from Phoenix, and we thought it would be nice for everyone to meet properly. I'd met Gerald and Patricia Monroe at the wedding 2 years ago. Gerald was a retired insurance executive with a firm handshake and a way of looking at you like he was calculating your net worth. Patricia had the kind of polished smile that never quite reached her eyes, and a habit of complimenting things in ways that sounded faintly like criticism. "What an interesting choice of paint color," she'd said about Caroline's carefully selected sage green walls. "So, vintage." "Sure," I said. "The more the merrier." "Great. Oh, and Dad, don't go to too much trouble. We'll keep it casual." After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen and tried to identify the feeling settling in my chest. Not quite unease, but not comfort either. Something about the way he'd phrased it, "don't go to too much trouble," suggested they had their own agenda for the visit. I spent Saturday cleaning the house top to bottom, not because it needed it, but because Caroline would have. I vacuumed the living room rug, dusted the furniture, and arranged fresh flowers from the garden she'd planted. The chrysanthemums were blooming now, deep burgundy and golden yellow. The colors she'd said reminded her of autumn in New England where she'd grown up. Sunday afternoon arrived crisp and clear. The kind of October day that made you grateful to live somewhere with real seasons. I'd spent the morning making Caroline's pot roast, following her handwritten recipe card that was stained with decades of use. The meat was tender, the vegetables perfectly cooked, and the kitchen smelled like Sunday dinner should. They arrived in Gerald's spotless silver Lexus at exactly 3 o'clock. Ethan emerged first, looking prosperous in his navy blazer and khakis. Madison followed, elegant in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in a year. Gerald and Patricia climbed out of the back seat with the careful movements of people who had learned to protect their dignity at all costs. "Dad?" Ethan embraced me with the kind of hug that felt performative, lasting exactly long enough to seem genuine. "The place looks great. Your mother always kept a nice house," I said, though I was the one who had spent 3 hours polishing everything. Madison kissed my cheek, her perfume sharp and expensive. "Richard, thank you so much for having us. Gerald and Patricia have been looking forward to seeing your beautiful home." Gerald's handshake was predictably firm. "Richard, lovely place you have here. Real estate in this area must be worth quite a bit." Patricia smiled her careful smile. "Madison's told us so much about the family homestead. It's exactly as charming as she described." Family homestead. Caroline would have bristled at that phrase. This wasn't some ancestral estate passed down through generations. It was a house we'd bought with a construction loan and 30 years of hard work. I led them into the living room, where Caroline's furniture sat arranged just as she'd liked it. The burgundy sofa faced the fireplace, flanked by the matching chairs we'd found at an estate sale in Wisconsin. Family photos covered the mantel and side tables. Ethan's school pictures, our wedding photo, snapshots from vacations and holidays. 37 years of marriage distilled into silver frames. "This is so cozy," Patricia said, settling into Caroline's favorite chair without asking. "Very lived in. Lived in." Another one of those compliments that wasn't. I served drinks, beer for the men, white wine for the ladies, and we made small talk about the weather, Gerald's golf game, Patricia's book club. The conversation felt like a play where everyone knew their lines except me. Finally, as we were finishing the main course, Ethan cleared his throat. "So, Dad, we wanted to share our exciting news." "I'm all ears." Madison reached over and squeezed Ethan's hand. "We've decided to renew our vows. It'll be our 3rd anniversary next month, and we thought it would be meaningful to reaffirm our commitment." "That's wonderful," I said, and meant it. "Where are you thinking of having the ceremony?" The silence that followed lasted just a beat too long. Gerald and Patricia exchanged glances. Madison's smile brightened in a way that seemed forced. Ethan straightened in his chair. "Actually," he said, "we were hoping to have it here, in the backyard. Madison's always loved the garden, and with Mom gone..." He trailed off, as if Caroline's death somehow transferred ownership of her dreams to his wife. I set down my fork carefully. "Here? It would be perfect," Madison chimed in. "Intimate, meaningful, family. We're thinking maybe 40 or 50 people, nothing too elaborate. The house has such lovely bones," Patricia added. "With a little updating, it could be quite elegant." Updating. I looked around the room, seeing it through their eyes for the first time. The wallpaper Caroline had chosen, the furniture we'd accumulated over decades, the careful arrangement of objects that told the story of our life together. It wasn't elegant in the way Patricia meant. It was something better. It was home. "I appreciate the thought," I said slowly, "but I'm not sure I'm ready to host something like that." Gerald leaned forward. "Richard, may I speak frankly?" I nodded, though something in his tone suggested I wouldn't like what he had to say. "This house is far too much for one person to maintain. Madison and Ethan have been worried about you rattling around in here alone. A celebration like this could be just the thing to bring some life back to the place." Rattling around? The phrase hit like a small slap. Caroline had never made me feel like I was rattling around anywhere. "What Gerald means," Patricia interjected smoothly, "is that houses need families. They're meant to be filled with laughter and celebration, not..." She gestured vaguely at the quiet room. "Not what?" I asked. "Not sitting empty while you live like a hermit," Ethan said, his voice carrying an edge I hadn't heard before. "Mom wouldn't have wanted this, Dad. She would have wanted the house to be used, to be happy again." The presumption took my breath away. He was speaking for Caroline, interpreting her wishes through the lens of his own convenience, as if he'd known her better than the man who had shared her bed for 37 years. Your mother, I said quietly, wanted this house to be our sanctuary. She picked out every piece of furniture, planted every flower in that garden, chose the paint colors Patricia finds so vintage. This isn't just a venue, Ethan, it's her legacy. Which is exactly why we should use it, Madison said, her voice taking on the patient tone you'd use with a difficult child. To honor her memory, to create new happy memories in the space she loved. With your friends, I said, people she never met. With family, Ethan corrected. People who love us, people who want to celebrate our marriage in the place where I grew up. I looked at my son, really looked at him. When had his jaw gotten so sharp, his eyes so calculating? When had he started speaking to me like I was an obstacle to be managed rather than a father to be respected? I need to think about it, I said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Gerald's expression hardened. Patricia's smile turned brittle. Madison's fingers tightened around her wine glass. But it was Ethan's reaction that cut the deepest. He didn't argue or plead or try to understand my hesitation. Instead, he leaned back in his chair with the kind of smile I'd seen him use on difficult clients. "Dad," he said, his voice perfectly calm, "let me be clear about something. This isn't really a request. Mom left you this house, yes, but I'm your only heir. Eventually, it'll be mine anyway. We're not asking permission to use our future home for our vow renewal. We're giving you the courtesy of advance notice." The words hung in the air like smoke. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, slow and heavy. Your future home? Come on, Dad, be realistic. You're 72 years old. You can't maintain this place forever. And when the time comes, hopefully not for many years, Madison and I will inherit it anyway. So, really, what's the difference? Patricia nodded approvingly. Gerald was studying me with the expression of a man watching a stock price fall. Madison squeezed Ethan's hand again, this time in clear support. I stood up slowly, my napkin falling to the floor. In the kitchen, the coffee pot was still on, filling the house with the smell of Caroline's favorite blend. Through the window, I could see her garden, the chrysanthemums she'd planted nodding in the afternoon breeze. The difference, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, is that I'm not dead yet. Ethan's smile faltered for just a moment. Dad, I didn't mean... Yes, I said, you did. I walked to the mantel and picked up our wedding photo. Caroline in her grandmother's dress, me in a rented tux, both of us impossibly young and certain that love was enough to build a life on. It had been for 37 years. This house, I said, still holding the photo, was never about investment or inheritance or future planning. It was about two people who loved each other, building something that would last. Every room has a story. Every corner holds a memory. Your mother spent hours planning that garden, choosing colors that would bloom in sequence from spring through fall. She painted these walls, hung these pictures, arranged this furniture to create a home. I set the photo back on the mantel and turned to face them. And you want to use it as a party venue. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Finally, Gerald cleared his throat. Richard, I understand you're emotional about this, but emotion doesn't change facts. The boy is right. This will be his house someday. Why not let him use it now, while you can still enjoy seeing it filled with celebration? Because, I said, looking directly at Ethan, this isn't your house, it's mine, and it will be until the day I die. Ethan's mask finally slipped completely. His face hardened into an expression I'd never seen before, cold, calculating, and completely devoid of the warmth I'd thought was still there beneath all the distance. Fine, he said, standing up and throwing his napkin on the table. Then I guess we know where we stand, don't we? Madison gathered her purse with practiced efficiency. Gerald and Patricia rose with the dignity of people who were used to getting their way and didn't appreciate being denied. This is unfortunate, Richard, Gerald said. We'd hoped to handle this as a family. As a family, I repeated. Interesting choice of words. They filed out without another word. I watched through the window as they climbed into Gerald's Lexus and drove away, leaving me alone with a dining room table full of half-finished meals and the echo of my son's words hanging in the air. This will be his house someday. I cleared the table slowly, scraping food into the garbage disposal, loading dishes into the dishwasher Caroline had insisted we buy, even though she preferred washing everything by hand. The routine movements helped steady my hands, though they did nothing for the hollowed-out feeling in my chest. When the kitchen was clean, I poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon, the good bottle Caroline had bought for our last anniversary, and sat in her reading chair. The house felt different now, smaller somehow, as if Ethan's words had changed the fundamental nature of the space. For 37 years, this had been our sanctuary, the place where Caroline and I had built our life together. Tonight, for the first time, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like territory under siege. I raised the glass to the empty room, to Caroline's photo on the mantel, to the chrysanthemums blooming faithfully in the gathering dusk. "Well, sweetheart," I said aloud, my voice steady despite everything. "Looks like we've got a problem to solve." The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking the end of one of the most important days I'd had since Caroline's funeral. Because today was the day I learned that my son wasn't the man I'd raised him to be. And more importantly, it was the day I decided to do something about it. The bourbon burned going down, but not as much as the memory of Ethan's words. I sat in Caroline's chair until well past midnight, listening to the house settle around me. Every creak and sigh felt amplified in the silence. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the furnace cycling on and off, the soft tick of the grandfather clock, marking time that suddenly felt precious in a way it hadn't before. This will be his house someday. I'd raised that boy from diapers to diploma, taught him to throw a curveball and change a tire, walked him through his first heartbreak, and celebrated his first job. But somewhere along the way, the child who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms had become a man who spoke about my death like a business transaction. When I finally made it upstairs, I paused at the bedroom doorway. Caroline's side of the bed still looked exactly as she'd left it, her book on the nightstand, reading glasses folded neatly on top, the small dish where she'd kept her wedding ring when her arthritis made it too uncomfortable to wear. I'd been sleeping on the couch more nights than not since the funeral, unable to face the vast emptiness of our king-sized bed. Tonight felt different. Tonight, I needed to be surrounded by her presence. I slipped under the covers and reached across to touch her pillow, still soft with the memory of her head. The grief hit fresh, the way it sometimes did in unguarded moments. Not the dull ache I'd learned to carry, but the sharp stab of loss that could still bring me to my knees. "What would you do, Caroline?" I whispered to the darkness. "How do I handle this?" But I already knew what she'd say. Caroline had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when it came to protecting what mattered most. She'd fought the insurance company when they tried to deny coverage for my back surgery. She'd fought the city council when they wanted to rezone our neighborhood for commercial development. And she'd fought Ethan's teenage rebellion with the kind of patient firmness that eventually wore down his defenses. "Sometimes, Richard," she'd said after one particularly difficult confrontation with 16-year-old Ethan, "love means setting boundaries. If you don't teach them where the lines are, they'll keep pushing until there's nothing left to push against." I must have dozed, because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was filtering through the bedroom curtains. My first conscious thought was that Caroline should have been there, warm and breathing beside me. My second was that I had work to do. The coffee tasted bitter without her to share it with, but I drank it anyway while planning my day. First, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. Not just Ethan's entitlement, but the legal realities of property ownership and inheritance law. Then I needed to figure out how to protect what Caroline and I had built together. I spent Monday morning in my home office, a small room off the kitchen where Caroline used to pay bills and manage our household finances. Her filing system was still intact, color-coded folders for insurance, taxes, medical records, and property documents. She'd been meticulous about keeping everything organized, a habit that had occasionally driven me crazy during our marriage, but which I now recognized as one of her greatest gifts. The deed to the house was exactly where she'd filed it, in a folder marked Real Estate Current. The language was clear and unambiguous. The property was titled in both our names as joint tenants with rights of survivorship. When Caroline died, her half had automatically transferred to me. No probate court, no waiting period, no legal ambiguity. The house was mine, free and clear. I made photocopies of everything. The deed, the property tax records, the mortgage satisfaction letter from '98 when we'd made our final payment. Then I called Marcus Henley, the attorney who'd handled our wills and estate planning for the past 15 years. "Richard," Marcus said when his secretary put me through, "good to hear from you. How are you holding up?" "Could be better, Marcus. I need to see you about something. Property law, inheritance issues. It's complicated." Family disputes usually are. Can you be here this afternoon? Marcus's office occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian downtown, the kind of place that inspired confidence through understated dignity rather than flashy displays of success. His waiting room smelled of leather and lemon oil, and the magazines on the coffee table were current, small details that spoke to attention and care. When Marcus emerged from his inner office, he looked every inch the successful small-town lawyer, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of steady presence that came from 40 years of helping people navigate life's complications. We'd known each other since high school, though our paths had diverged significantly after graduation. "You look troubled, Richard," he said, settling behind his mahogany desk. "What's going on?" I told him everything. Ethan's announcement, the pressure from Madison's parents, the casual way my son had dismissed my ownership of the house I'd lived in for over 3 decades. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. "Let me be clear about the legal situation," he said when I finished. "The property is titled solely in your name now. You have absolute authority to determine who uses it and under what circumstances. Ethan has no legal claim to the property while you're alive, regardless of what he might inherit eventually." "But he's right about the inheritance part?" Marcus shrugged. "That depends entirely on your will. Do you want him to inherit the house?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a doused fire. A week ago, I would have answered without hesitation. Of course Ethan would inherit the house. He was my only child, the continuation of the family line, the keeper of our memories. But that was before he'd looked me in the eye and spoken about my death like a pending stock transfer. "I'm not sure anymore," I said honestly. "Well, you don't have to decide today. But Richard, I want you to understand something important. The way your son spoke to you yesterday, that's not normal family dynamics. That's someone who's already begun to think of your assets as his assets. It's concerning." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying me with the kind of careful attention I'd seen him use during depositions. "Have there been other incidents? Other times when Ethan has acted like he has more authority over your affairs than he actually does?" I thought back over the past 3 years, replaying conversations and interactions through this new lens. The subtle pressure to downsize after Caroline's death. The suggestion that I should consider a retirement community for peace of mind and social interaction. The way Madison had started referring to holiday traditions as things they might continue or modify going forward. "Nothing as direct as yesterday," I said, "but looking back, there's been a pattern. Small things. Comments about how much work the house must be. Suggestions about lifestyle changes that might make me more comfortable. Classic elder manipulation tactics," Marcus said grimly. "The good news is that you're recognizing it now, while you still have full control over your affairs. The bad news is that it's likely to escalate." He pulled out a fresh legal pad and began writing. "Here's what I recommend. First, we update your will to reflect your current feelings about inheritance. We can always change it again later, but for now, let's make sure you have options. Second, I want to prepare some documents that clearly establish your sole authority over the property, something we can use if Ethan continues to act as if he has rights he doesn't actually possess." We spent the next hour going through the details. Marcus would draft a new will that placed the house in a trust, with specific instructions about its use and eventual disposition. He'd also prepare a formal notice to cease and desist any attempts to use the property without my explicit written permission. "One more thing, Richard," he said as I gathered my papers to leave. "Document everything. Every conversation, every demand, every instance where Ethan or his wife acts as if they have authority they don't possess. If this situation deteriorates, we'll want a clear record of the pattern." Driving home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose, of forward momentum. For 3 years, I'd been drifting through my days, going through the motions of living without any real direction. Now, suddenly, I had a mission, protecting what Caroline and I had built together. The house looked different when I pulled into the driveway, not smaller or more fragile, as it had yesterday, but more precious, more worth defending. I walked through each room slowly, seeing not just furniture and decorations, but the accumulated weight of 37 years of shared life. In the living room, I paused before the photo collage Caroline had created for our 35th anniversary, dozens of pictures spanning our entire relationship. The young couple who had met at a church dance, the newlyweds in their first apartment, the exhausted but happy parents with baby Ethan, the mature couple at various family celebrations. The progression told the story of two people who'd grown together rather than apart, who'd built something substantial and lasting. The phone rang just as I was fixing myself a simple dinner. Ethan's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I considered not answering, but avoidance wouldn't solve anything. "Hello, son." "Dad?" His voice was carefully neutral, professionally pleasant. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday. Madison and I have been talking, and we realize we might have come on a little strong." "Might have." "Look, we don't want this to become a big family issue. We love you, we respect you, and we want to work something out that makes everyone happy." The words sounded reasonable, even conciliatory, but there was something underneath them, a current of impatience, as if he were following a script designed to manage a difficult situation. "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked. "Well, what if we scaled back the celebration? Maybe 20 people instead of 50? Very intimate, very family-focused. We could use the backyard, but not the house itself. You wouldn't have to worry about people tracking through Mom's things." Mom's things. As if Caroline's careful arrangement of our home was just clutter to be worked around. "And what about what I said yesterday, about this being my house, not yours?" There was a pause, long enough that I could almost hear him recalibrating his approach. "Dad, you're absolutely right. It is your house, and we should have asked permission instead of just assuming. We got excited about the idea and didn't think through how it might affect you. That's on us." The apology sounded genuine, and for a moment I felt the old familiar tug of parental pride. This was more like the son I'd raised, capable of recognizing his mistakes and making amends. "I appreciate you saying that, Ethan. So, would you consider it? The smaller celebration? We could even have it catered so you wouldn't have to do any of the work." And there it was, the assumption that my objection was about inconvenience rather than principle, that what bothered me was the effort involved rather than the casual dismissal of my authority over my own property. "I need more time to think about it," I said. "Of course, take all the time you need. But Dad, Madison's parents are only in town for 2 more weeks, and they're really hoping to be part of the celebration. If we're going to do this, we need to start planning soon." After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen and tried to sort through what I'd heard. On the surface, it had been a reasonable conversation. A son acknowledging his mistake and asking for consideration. But underneath, the pressure remained. The timeline, the emotional manipulation about Madison's parents, the assumption that my eventual agreement was inevitable. That night, I opened Caroline's desk and began making lists. On one sheet of paper, I documented everything that had happened since yesterday. The words used, the attitudes displayed, the assumptions made. On another, I began outlining what I knew about the people involved, Gerald's background in insurance, and his obvious interest in property values, Patricia's subtle but persistent criticism of our lifestyle choices, Madison's growing distance since the wedding. As I wrote, a picture emerged of a coordinated campaign, not necessarily conscious or malicious, but a family system that had identified me as an obstacle to their plans and had begun working systematically to overcome my resistance. Caroline would have seen it immediately. She'd always been better at reading people's underlying motivations, at seeing the patterns that I missed. Without her insights to guide me, I'd been vulnerable to manipulation in ways I was only now beginning to understand. But understanding was the first step toward protection. And protection, I was beginning to realize, might require more than just legal documents and firmly worded refusals. It might require a demonstration of exactly whose house this really was. I closed Caroline's desk and walked through the quiet rooms one more time before bed. In each space, I could feel her presence, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living part of the foundation we'd built together. This house wasn't just property to be inherited or a venue to be borrowed. It was the physical manifestation of our marriage, the container that held 37 years of shared dreams and accumulated love. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of making sure it stayed that way. The next morning brought rain, the kind of steady, soaking drizzle that turned October leaves into slick carpets and made the house feel like a fortress against the world. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee, watching water bead and run down the glass, and thought about fortresses, how they were built not just to keep enemies out, but to protect what was precious inside. Caroline's garden looked different in the gray light. The chrysanthemums drooped under the weight of accumulated moisture, their brilliant colors muted but somehow more substantial. She'd always said rain made everything more honest, stripped away the pretense and showed you what was really there beneath the surface. I was seeing a lot beneath surfaces these days. The phone had rung twice already, once from a number I didn't recognize, once from Madison's cell. I'd let both go to voicemail, not out of spite, but because I needed time to think without the pressure of immediate response. The messages could wait. The decisions I was making couldn't be rushed. After breakfast, I drove to the bank where Caroline and I had done business for 23 years. The rain had lightened to a mist, but the sky remained the color of old pewter, pressing down on the town like a heavy blanket. First National occupied a corner building downtown, the kind of solid brick structure that suggested permanence and reliability. Inside, everything smelled faintly of coffee and clean paper. Janet Morrison had been our banker since the early days of my construction business, back when every loan required 3 references and a detailed explanation of exactly how I planned to pay it back. She'd watched us buy our first house, refinance for renovations, and finally pay off the mortgage 8 years early. More importantly, she'd sent flowers to Caroline's funeral and a handwritten note that mentioned specific memories of their conversations over the years. "Richard," she said, rising from behind her desk when I knocked on her office door, "how are you managing?" "Taking things one day at a time," I said, settling into the familiar chair across from her desk. "Janet, I need to understand something about joint accounts and inheritance. Specifically, what happens to assets when there's family disagreement about their use?" Her expression grew more serious. "Are you having problems with Ethan?" The directness of the question caught me off guard. Janet had known our family for decades, had processed the paperwork when we'd added Ethan as a beneficiary on various accounts, had seen us together during routine banking business. If she was asking specifically about problems with my son, it suggested she'd already formed some impressions. "What makes you ask that?" Janet glanced toward her office door, then leaned forward slightly. "Because he was here last week, asking questions about your accounts, specifically about what would happen to the house and your assets if you became incapacitated." The words hit like cold water. Incapacitated? He said he was concerned about your ability to manage your finances as you get older, wanted to know about power of attorney procedures, about how the bank handles situations where family members need to step in. I sat back in my chair, feeling something fundamental shift in my understanding of recent events. Ethan's visit to our family dinner hadn't been an impulsive announcement about a vow renewal ceremony. It had been part of a larger strategy, one that included research into my financial vulnerabilities. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing specific about your accounts, of course. Privacy laws prevent that. But I did explain general procedures, which I would do for any family member asking hypothetical questions." Janet's expression was carefully neutral, but I could see concern in her eyes. "Richard, I probably shouldn't say this, but his questions didn't sound hypothetical. They sounded like someone planning for a specific eventuality, planning for me to become incompetent. Or planning to have you declared incompetent," she said quietly. "There's a difference." We spent the next hour reviewing my accounts and discussing options for protecting my assets from potential manipulation. Janet explained how elder financial abuse often began with small boundary violations, family members making assumptions about authority, gradually taking over decision-making processes, isolating the elder from other sources of support and information. "The pattern is usually subtle at first," she said. "Comments about how hard it must be to manage everything alone, suggestions about simplifying finances, pressure to add family members to accounts for convenience. By the time the elder realizes what's happening, they have often already signed away significant control." I thought about Ethan's comments at dinner, his casual assumption that the house would eventually be his anyway, his impatience with my hesitation about the vow renewal ceremony. What I'd interpreted as grief-induced insensitivity might actually have been something more calculated. "Janet, I want to make some changes. Remove Ethan as a beneficiary on the checking and savings accounts, at least temporarily, and I want to set up an appointment with someone who can explain my options for protecting the house." By the time I left the bank, the rain had stopped, and weak sunlight was struggling through the clouds. I drove home through streets lined with maple and oak trees, their leaves beginning to show the first hints of autumn color. The familiarity of the route, past the high school where Ethan had played baseball, past the park where I'd taught him to ride a bike, past the church where Caroline and I had been married, felt different now, less like a comfortable routine and more like an inventory of memories under threat. The house sat solid and welcoming in the afternoon light, its windows reflecting the sky like watchful eyes. I pulled into the garage, the same garage where I'd taught Ethan to change oil, where we'd worked on science projects, where Caroline had set up her pottery wheel during her ceramic phase, and felt a surge of protective anger. This wasn't just real estate. This was the accumulated weight of 3 generations. The grandparents who had saved for the down payment, the parents who had raised their son here, the memories that lived in every corner. If Ethan thought he could manipulate or intimidate his way into early ownership, he was about to learn how wrong he could be. Inside, the message light on the answering machine was blinking. 4 new messages. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down to listen. Madison's voice, carefully controlled. "Richard, I hope you'll reconsider about the celebration. We really don't want this to become a source of family tension. Please call us." Gerald's voice, smooth and reasonable. "Richard, perhaps we got off on the wrong foot yesterday. I'd like to take you to lunch this week, just the 2 of us, man to man. There might be some mutually beneficial solutions we haven't considered." Patricia's voice, sweetly concerned. "Richard, dear, I hope you know how much we all care about you. We're worried that you might be isolating yourself unnecessarily. Sometimes talking to a counselor can help with the adjustment process after a major loss." And finally, Ethan's voice, carrying an edge I was learning to recognize. "Dad, we need to talk. Soon. This situation is getting out of hand, and I think there might be some misunderstandings that need to be cleared up. Call me tonight." I deleted all 4 messages without returning any of the calls. Instead, I walked through the house slowly, seeing it with new eyes. In the living room, I studied the photographs on the mantle, not just the happy family moments, but the underlying story they told. Ethan as a toddler, secure in his parents' arms. Ethan as a young boy, proud of his first-place ribbon at the science fair. Ethan as a teenager, sullen and distant, but still fundamentally connected to family. Ethan as a young man, confident and ambitious, starting his career in commercial real estate. When had the distance begun? When had the confident young man become someone who would research his father's financial vulnerabilities while planning what amounted to a hostile takeover of the family home? The answer, I realized, lay in the gaps between the photographs. The missed holidays after Caroline's diagnosis, the shortened visits during her illness, the perfunctory appearance at the funeral, followed by an immediate return to his own life and concerns. Grief affected people differently, but Ethan's grief had seemed to push him away from family connection rather than toward it. Or maybe grief had simply revealed something that was already there. That evening, I called Marcus Henley at home. He answered on the second ring, sounding tired but alert. "Richard, everything all right? I need to move faster on those documents we discussed, and I need to understand something about elder law, specifically what happens when family members try to have someone declared incompetent." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "What's happened?" I told him about Ethan's visit to the bank, about the coordinated phone messages, about the growing pressure to acquiesce to demands I hadn't even fully understood yet. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making what sounded like notes. "Richard, this is serious. What you're describing isn't normal family concern. It's the beginning stages of what we call a soft takeover. The good news is that you're recognizing it early. The bad news is that it's likely to escalate when they realize you're not going to be as cooperative as they'd hoped. What should I expect? More pressure, more involvement from Madison's parents, possibly suggestions that you need professional help or supervision. They might start involving other people, neighbors, your doctor, anyone who might support their narrative that you're not managing well on your own." Marcus paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Richard, I want to be clear about something. The actions you're describing could be preparation for a guardianship petition. If they can convince a court that you're no longer competent to manage your own affairs, they could be granted legal authority over your property and finances. It's not easy to prove, but it happens more often than people realize. The implications hit like a physical blow. Not only were they planning to use my house for their celebration, they might be planning to take it away entirely. How do I protect myself? Documentation, first and foremost. Medical evaluations showing your competency, financial records showing responsible management, character witnesses who can testify to your mental acuity, and most importantly, legal structures that make it harder for anyone to challenge your authority over your own property. We made an appointment for the following morning. Marcus would have the trust documents ready, along with a power of attorney that explicitly excluded family members from any authority over my affairs. He'd also prepare what he called a competency package, medical evaluations, financial statements, and other documentation that would make it difficult for anyone to question my ability to make my own decisions. After we hung up, I sat in Caroline's chair and tried to process what was happening. A week ago, my biggest concern had been whether to plant bulbs for spring flowers. Now I was preparing to defend myself against my own son's attempt to seize control of my life. The irony was bitter. Ethan was behaving exactly like the developers I'd battled during my construction days. People who identified valuable property and then found ways to acquire it regardless of the current owner's wishes. The only difference was that this developer shared my DNA. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house in my robe and slippers, touching surfaces Caroline had polished, adjusting pillows she'd arranged, breathing air still faintly scented with her lavender sachets. In our bedroom, I stood before the dresser where she'd kept her jewelry. Nothing expensive, just the simple pieces I'd given her over the years. Her engagement ring, the pearl necklace from our 10th anniversary, the gold bracelet Ethan had saved his allowance to buy for Mother's Day when he was 12. The boy who'd been so proud of that bracelet, so eager to see his mother smile when she opened the small velvet box, seemed like a different person entirely from the man who was now researching ways to have me declared incompetent. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe I'd been holding on to the memory of that 12-year-old boy so tightly that I'd failed to see the man he'd actually become. I opened Caroline's jewelry box and carefully lifted out the bracelet. The gold had aged to a soft, warm glow, and I could still read the inscription Ethan had insisted the jeweler engrave. For Mom, love forever, Ethan. Love forever. The promise of a child who couldn't imagine a world where love might not be enough. I held the bracelet up to the lamplight and made my own promise, not to the boy Ethan had been, but to the woman who'd treasured this simple gift. I would protect what we'd built together. I would preserve the home she'd created with such care and intention, and I would do it with the same patient determination she'd brought to everything she touched. Tomorrow, I would begin building defenses. Tonight, I would say goodbye to the last of my illusions about family loyalty. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. In the morning, I would start the process of saving my life's work from my own son. But for now, I simply stood in the bedroom I'd shared with Caroline for 37 years, holding a piece of gold that represented everything that had been lost and everything that still remained worth fighting for. The morning came gray and purposeful, the kind of October day that made you grateful for strong coffee and clear objectives. I was dressed and ready by 7:30, wearing the same navy suit I'd worn to Caroline's funeral. Not out of sentiment, but because it was the kind of clothing that commanded respect in legal offices and bank conference rooms. Marcus Henley's office felt different this time, less like a consultation and more like a war room. He'd spread documents across his mahogany desk in neat piles, each stack representing a different aspect of what he called defensive estate planning. The morning light streaming through his windows caught the gold lettering on leather-bound law books, giving the room an almost ceremonial gravity. "I've prepared everything we discussed," Marcus said, settling behind his desk with the focused attention of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. "But before we proceed, I want to make sure you understand what we're doing and why." He pulled out a yellow legal pad covered with his precise handwriting. What your son and his in-laws attempted Sunday wasn't just presumptuous. It was a classic opening move in what elder law attorneys call inheritance acceleration. The basic strategy is to convince the elderly person that their resistance to family demands is unreasonable, that they're being difficult or stubborn, that they should be grateful for the family's willingness to help. Help, I repeated, tasting the bitterness of the word. The next phase usually involves more direct pressure. They'll suggest you're not managing well on your own, that you need supervision or assistance. They might involve your doctor, claiming you seem confused or forgetful. The goal is to establish a pattern of behavior that could support a guardianship petition. Marcus reached for the first stack of documents. These trust papers will transfer ownership of your house to the Richard Dalton Revocable Living Trust, with you as the sole trustee. Functionally, nothing changes. You still control everything. But legally, it creates a barrier. If someone wants to challenge your decisions about the property, they'll have to go through trust law, which is much more complex than simple inheritance disputes. I reviewed each page carefully, remembering Caroline's insistence that we always read everything before signing. The language was dense but clear. The house would belong to the trust. managed according to my wishes, protected from creditors and potential legal challenges. Most importantly, the trust could be modified or revoked only by me, and only while I was mentally competent. What about after I die? That's up to you. The trust can specify any distribution you want, to family, to charity, to a combination of beneficiaries. You can even include conditional language that requires beneficiaries to meet certain criteria before inheriting. I thought about Ethan's casual assumption that the house would eventually be his, regardless of how he treated me in the meantime. The trust would give me the ability to ensure that inheritance came with strings attached, or not at all. Let's proceed. The signing took 45 minutes, with Marcus explaining each section and ensuring I understood every clause. When we finished, he handed me a sealed envelope containing copies of all documents, along with a business card for Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a geriatrician who specialized in competency evaluations. I want you to schedule a complete physical and cognitive assessment with Dr. Chen within the next 2 weeks, Marcus said. Not because I think you need it, but because we want current medical documentation of your mental acuity. If anyone tries to question your competency later, we'll have professional evidence to counter their claims. Driving home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of forward momentum, of taking action rather than simply enduring circumstances. The trust documents in the sealed envelope represented more than legal protection. They represented the reclamation of my own authority over my life. The house looked the same when I pulled into the driveway, but it felt different, more secure somehow, more definitively mine. I walked through each room slowly, seeing familiar objects with new eyes. Caroline's china cabinet, my leather reading chair, the dining room table where we had hosted 37 Thanksgiving dinners, all of it now protected by legal structures that would be difficult to challenge or circumvent. The phone was ringing when I entered the kitchen. I let it go to the machine, listening as Ethan's voice filled the room with barely controlled impatience. Dad, you haven't returned any of our calls. We're starting to worry that maybe you're not thinking clearly about this situation. Madison's parents are leaving town next week, and we need to make decisions. Please call me back today. Not thinking clearly. The phrase was loaded with implication, the first subtle suggestion that my judgment might be impaired. Marcus had warned me to expect exactly this kind of language. Instead of returning the call, I drove to the small electronics store downtown, where they sold security systems and home automation equipment. The owner, Bill Hastings, had done electrical work for me during my construction days and still occasionally called when he needed help with building permits or code questions. "Richard," he said, looking up from a tangle of cables on his workbench, "haven't seen you in a while. How are you managing since Caroline passed?" "Taking things one day at a time. Bill, I need your advice about home security. Nothing elaborate, just something to help me keep track of who's coming and going around the property." Bill nodded thoughtfully. "Break-in concerns. This is still a pretty safe neighborhood. Family concerns," I said, which was both more honest and more complicated than a simple burglary worry. We spent an hour discussing options. Bill recommended a system that would allow me to monitor entry points remotely, record video when motion was detected, and receive alerts on my phone when anyone approached the house. The installation would be unobtrusive, small cameras positioned to look like standard exterior lighting, sensors that could be painted to match the house trim. "When can you install it?" "This weekend, if you want. Saturday morning work for you?" That evening, I called my doctor's office and scheduled the comprehensive examination Marcus had recommended. Dr. Patricia Morse had been Caroline's physician, as well as mine, for over 15 years, and she'd known us as a couple longer than we'd been patients. If anyone could provide credible testimony about my mental state, it would be her. Then I opened Caroline's desk and began documenting everything that had happened since Sunday's dinner. I wrote down exact quotes as I remembered them, noted the timeline of phone calls and messages, described the tone and body language I'd observed during our confrontation. The exercise was both therapeutic and strategically important, creating a record that could be used to demonstrate the coordinated nature of the pressure I was experiencing. As I wrote, I found myself remembering other incidents from recent months. The casual comments about how tired I looked, how difficult it must be to maintain such a large house alone, how much easier life might be in a retirement community. Suggestions I'd dismissed as well-meaning concern now appeared in a different light, as pieces of a larger narrative being constructed to support a predetermined conclusion. The phone rang again around 8 o'clock. This time it was Madison, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to managing difficult clients. "Richard, I hope you know how much we love you and how concerned we are. Gerald and Patricia have been asking about you all day. They're worried that maybe you're feeling overwhelmed by everything." "I'm managing fine, Madison. I'm sure you are. But sometimes it's hard to see our own limitations. That's why families help each other. That's why we want to be more involved in your life." The phrasing was careful, supportive, and completely manipulative. By framing their intrusion as help and my resistance as limitation, she was positioning herself as the reasonable party in any dispute. "What exactly are you offering to help with?" "Well, for starters, we could take some of the pressure off you regarding household management. I know how much work it must be to maintain everything exactly the way Caroline left it. Maybe it's time to consider some updates, some simplification." Simplification, another loaded term that could mean anything from decluttering to wholesale changes in the house Caroline had spent decades perfecting. "The house is fine as it is." "Of course it is," Madison said quickly. "We're not suggesting major changes, just some small improvements that might make daily life easier. Maybe we could start with the vow renewal celebration. Use it as an opportunity to refresh some of the spaces, bring in some new energy." There it was, the assumption that the celebration would happen regardless of my wishes, wrapped in language about refreshing and new energy. As if Caroline's carefully chosen decor was somehow stale or outdated rather than deliberately preserved. "Madison, let me be clear about something. There will be no vow renewal celebration at this house. Not now, not ever. This is not a venue. It's my home." The silence that followed was long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its practiced warmth. "Richard, I think you're making a mistake. Family is the most important thing, and you're letting stubbornness get in the way of what could be a beautiful celebration of love and commitment." "My stubbornness," I said, "is what's kept this family together for 37 years. And it's what will protect what Caroline and I built until the day I die." After I hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen and tried to process the conversation. Madison had managed to position my defense of my own property as selfishness, my preservation of Caroline's memory as resistance to positive change, my authority over my own home as stubbornness that threatened family harmony. It was expertly done, and it would probably sound reasonable to anyone who didn't understand the full context, which was exactly why I needed to document everything and build unshakable legal protections before the situation escalated further. The next morning brought Bill Hastings and his assistant, along with enough equipment to wire the house with comprehensive monitoring capability. I watched from the kitchen window as they installed cameras disguised as exterior lights, motion sensors that would trigger recording, and a small control panel that would allow me to monitor everything from my phone. "The system will alert you anytime someone approaches the house," Bill explained as he programmed the final settings. "You can review recorded footage, adjust sensitivity levels, even speak through the exterior cameras if you need to warn someone off. Can it record conversations? Audio and video, as long as people are on your property, all perfectly legal since it's your land and your security system." By Saturday evening, I had transformed my house into something Caroline never could have imagined. A fortress equipped with electronic eyes and ears, capable of documenting every visitor and recording every conversation. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to preserve the peaceful home she'd created, I'd been forced to turn it into something more closely resembling a surveillance operation. But as I tested the system one final time, watching my own image appear on my phone screen as I walked across the front porch, I felt a grim satisfaction. Whatever came next, I would be ready for it, and I would have evidence. The phone rang just as I was settling down with a cup of Caroline's favorite tea, the blend she'd special ordered from a company in Vermont. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, Gerald Monroe's smooth voice filled my ear. "Richard, I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to follow up on our conversation Sunday. Perhaps we got off on the wrong foot." "We got exactly where you intended to go, Gerald." A pause, followed by what might have been a chuckle. "You're a direct man, Richard. I appreciate that. In fact, I think we might have more in common than you realize. We're both men who understand the value of property, the importance of family legacy. My legacy is intact." "Is it? Because from where I sit, it looks like you're trying to preserve something that no longer exists." "Caroline is gone, Richard. Your son has moved on with his life. You're rattling around in a house that's too big for one person, clinging to memories instead of creating new ones. The phrase rattling around again, it seemed to be their preferred description of my life, as if living alone in the house I'd shared with my wife was somehow pathological rather than practical. What exactly are you suggesting, Gerald? A partnership. You have assets that aren't being fully utilized. We have family members who could help you manage those assets more effectively. Everyone benefits. By manage more effectively, you mean what exactly? Well, for starters, that house is worth significantly more than you probably realize. Real estate values in your neighborhood have appreciated dramatically. If you were to downsize to something more appropriate for a single person, the equity could fund a very comfortable retirement. There it was, the suggestion that had been lurking beneath all the other conversations. They didn't just want to use my house for their celebration. They wanted me to sell it and use the proceeds to subsidize my own displacement. And where would I live in this scenario? There are excellent retirement communities within an hour of here, places where you would have social interaction, medical support, activities designed for people in your stage of life, much more suitable than rattling around in that big empty house. Gerald's voice carried the confident tone of a man accustomed to closing deals, convinced that he had identified the key objection and provided a reasonable solution. In his world, this probably was reasonable. Elderly man trades unused space for managed care and social engagement. What he didn't understand was that the house wasn't unused space. It was the physical manifestation of the most successful partnership of my life, the container that held 37 years of shared dreams and accumulated love. Gerald, I said, let me help you understand something. This house isn't an asset to be managed or equity to be unlocked. It's my home. It's where I lived with Caroline, where I raised my son, where I intend to remain until I die. No amount of appreciation or social engineering is going to change that. Richard, I understand you're emotional about this. I'm not emotional. I'm decisive. And I've decided that you and your family need to stop planning my life for me. The line went quiet for several seconds. When Gerald spoke again, his voice had lost its practiced friendliness. I hope you'll reconsider, Richard. For everyone's sake. Sometimes the things we think are protecting us are actually isolating us from the people who care about us most. After he hung up, I sat in the gathering darkness of my kitchen and realized that the battle lines had been drawn. What had started as a disagreement about a vow renewal ceremony had evolved into something much larger, a contest over who would control the remainder of my life. On one side stood a coordinated group of people who saw my independence as an obstacle to their plans, who viewed my attachment to Caroline's memory as unhealthy resistance to positive change, who believed they knew better than I did what would make me happy. On the other side stood an old man in an empty house, armed with legal documents and electronic surveillance, determined to preserve what remained of the life he'd built with the woman he'd loved for 37 years. It wasn't a fair fight, but as I'd learned during 4 decades in the construction business, fair fights were rare. What mattered wasn't the odds. It was the quality of your foundation and the strength of your resolve. I had both, and tomorrow I would begin to show them exactly what that meant. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of October day that made you believe in the possibility of new beginnings. I was up before sunrise, moving through my morning routine with the methodical precision of a man preparing for battle. Coffee, shower, shave, then the same navy suit I had worn to meet with Marcus. If this was going to be a confrontation, I would meet it dressed for the occasion. The security system had recorded 3 separate visits to my property overnight, a jogger at 5:23 a.m., a neighbor walking her dog at 6:15, and at 11:47 p.m., a dark sedan that had driven slowly past the house twice before parking across the street for nearly 20 minutes. The license plate wasn't clearly visible in the darkness, but the timing suggested surveillance rather than coincidence. They were watching me now. Good. Let them see what they were dealing with. The phone rang at exactly 9 a.m. Ethan's voice, carefully controlled, but carrying an undertone I was learning to recognize as barely contained frustration. Dad, we need to talk, face to face. This situation has gotten completely out of hand. What situation would that be? Don't play games with me. Gerald told me about your conversation last night. This resistance to reasonable family input isn't healthy, and frankly, it's starting to worry people. People. The word was deliberately vague, suggesting a broader coalition of concern than just immediate family. It was the kind of language used to isolate someone, to make them feel like their perspective was uniquely unreasonable. I'm feeling very healthy, Ethan. Clear-headed, decisive, fully in control of my faculties and my property. Are you? Because your behavior this week suggests otherwise. Hanging up on family members, refusing to consider reasonable requests, isolating yourself from people who care about you. The phrasing was almost textbook, reframing my defense of boundaries as isolation, my exercise of authority as unreasonable behavior. If I'd been less prepared, less aware of the pattern, I might have begun to doubt my own judgment. Ethan, let me ask you something. When you went to the bank last week to inquire about my accounts and my competency, was that reasonable family concern or something else? The silence that followed was long enough to be its own answer. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its careful control. How did you... Never mind. Dad, the fact that you see normal family planning as some kind of conspiracy just proves my point. We're worried about you. Maybe you should talk to someone, get a professional perspective on what you're going through. I did talk to someone, my lawyer. Turns out I'm competent enough to make my own decisions about my own property. Funny how that works. Your lawyer? Ethan's voice sharpened. What lawyer? What decisions? Marcus Henley. We've made some arrangements to ensure my wishes regarding the house and my other assets are properly documented and legally protected. Another pause, shorter this time, but weighted with calculation. Dad, if you've made any major changes to your estate planning, we need to discuss it as a family. These kinds of decisions shouldn't be made in isolation. We need to discuss it as a family. The presumption was breathtaking, that my own estate planning required family approval, that decisions about my property were somehow subject to group consensus. The only discussion we need to have is about boundaries, Ethan. Mine are clearly established. Yours seem to be non-existent. Fine, he said, his mask finally slipping completely. If that's how you want to play it, we'll be over this afternoon. All of us. Madison's parents are leaving tomorrow, and we're going to settle this once and for all. The line went dead before I could respond. I sat in the sudden silence of my kitchen, feeling something shift inside me like a gear engaging. The pretense was over. Whatever came next would be direct confrontation, and I was ready for it. I spent the morning making final preparations. I called Dr. Morse's office and moved up my appointment to the following day, explaining that I needed current documentation of my mental and physical health. I called Marcus and left a message updating him on the morning's conversation. Then I tested the security system one more time, ensuring that every camera angle was optimized and every audio input was functioning properly. At 1:30 p.m., I positioned myself in Caroline's reading chair with a clear view of the front yard and my phone in easy reach. The security system would record everything, but I wanted to witness it firsthand, to see exactly what kind of people my son and his family had become. They arrived in convoy formation, Gerald's silver Lexus followed by a white BM I didn't recognize, probably a rental for Patricia's convenience. The precision of their timing suggested coordination, a planned approach rather than a spontaneous family visit. Ethan emerged first, moving with the aggressive confidence of a man who believed he held the winning hand. Madison followed, elegant as always, but with something harder in her posture, less conciliatory than she'd been in previous encounters. Gerald and Patricia climbed out of the Lexus with the careful dignity of people preparing for an important negotiation. But it was the fifth person who caught my attention, a woman in her 50s, professionally dressed, carrying a leather portfolio. She moved with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations, someone who had been briefed on the details and was prepared to provide expert support. They approached the house in formation, Ethan leading, the unknown woman slightly behind and to the left where she could observe without seeming to participate directly. It was the positioning of people who'd rehearsed their roles. I let them knock 3 times before answering the door. When I opened it, I kept my expression neutral and my body language calm. The security cameras would record their behavior, not mine. Ethan, Madison, Gerald, Patricia. I nodded to each in turn, then looked at the unknown woman. "And you are?" "Dr. Sarah Kellerman," she said, extending her hand with professional warmth. "I'm a geriatric counselor. Your family asked me to join today's conversation because they're concerned about your well-being." A geriatric counselor. They'd brought a professional to assess my mental state, someone who could provide expert testimony if they decided to pursue guardianship proceedings. The strategy was both audacious and revealing. They weren't here to negotiate or compromise. They were here to build a case. "How thoughtful," I said, stepping back to allow them entry. "Please, come in. I assume you'll want to record this consultation for your professional files." Dr. Kellerman looked slightly taken aback. "Actually, this is more of an informal conversation. Your son was hoping I could help facilitate some family communication." "Of course. Well, you should know that I record all conversations that take place on my property for security purposes. I hope that won't interfere with your professional assessment." The group exchanged glances, a moment of silent communication that confirmed they hadn't expected me to be prepared for their gambit. "Shall we sit in the living room?" I said, leading them toward the space where Caroline's furniture was arranged exactly as she'd left it. They settled themselves with the careful positioning of people claiming territory. Gerald took the chair closest to the fireplace, positioning himself as the patriarch of the gathering. Patricia chose the spot on the sofa, with the best view of family photographs, probably to reference them during her commentary. Madison sat beside her, hands folded, projecting supportive concern. Dr. Kellerman positioned herself where she could observe everyone while remaining slightly separate from the family dynamics. Ethan remained standing, taking the dominant position in the center of the room. "Dad," he began, "we're here because we care about you, and we're worried about some of the decisions you've been making lately." Such as refusing to consider reasonable requests from family, such as consulting lawyers about estate planning without involving the people who will be affected by those decisions, such as installing surveillance equipment to spy on your own family. The last accusation was delivered with particular emphasis, suggesting they'd noticed the security cameras and viewed them as evidence of paranoid behavior rather than reasonable precaution. "I installed security equipment to protect my property," I said calmly. "As for estate planning, my assets are mine to dispose of as I see fit, without consultation or approval from anyone else." Dr. Kellerman leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Dalton, may I ask how you've been feeling lately? Are you experiencing any anxiety or depression that might be affecting your judgment?" The question was phrased professionally, but it was designed to establish a record of mental health concerns. Any answer I gave could be interpreted as evidence of diminished capacity. Too much emotion would suggest instability. Too little would suggest detachment from reality. "I'm feeling like a man whose family has hired a stranger to evaluate his mental competence without his consent," I said. "How would you feel in that situation, Dr. Kellerman?" She maintained her professional composure, but I could see recognition in her eyes. She was experienced enough to know when someone was more aware of the dynamics than she'd been led to expect. "Your family is concerned that you may be isolating yourself unnecessarily, that grief over your wife's death may be affecting your ability to make sound decisions about your future. My grief is my own business. My decisions about my future are also my own business. The only concerning behavior I see here is a family that thinks it has the right to override my clearly expressed wishes about my own property." Gerald stood up, his patience finally exhausted. "Richard, let's dispense with the games. You're 72 years old, living alone in a house that's far too large for your needs, refusing reasonable suggestions from people who care about you, and making impulsive legal decisions that could affect your family's security." "Their security or their inheritance?" "Both," Patricia said, abandoning her pretense of gentle concern. "You can't live here forever, Richard. At some point, you're going to need care, supervision, medical support. It makes sense to plan for that transition while you still have the capacity to participate in the planning. And it makes sense for you to take control now, while there's still time to reshape things according to your preferences." Madison finally spoke, her voice carrying the sharp edge I'd heard glimpses of in our phone conversations. "Richard, you're being deliberately difficult. We're trying to help you, and you're treating us like enemies." "Are you helping me, Madison? Or are you helping yourselves to what I've spent 37 years building?" Ethan moved closer, his body language shifting from reasonable to confrontational. "Dad, this isn't negotiable anymore. We've been patient, we've tried to work with you, but your behavior is becoming erratic. Dr. Kellerman can document that. The bank has records of your suspicious inquiries about protecting assets from family members. Your neighbors have noticed the surveillance cameras, the isolation, the refusal to engage socially. It was a comprehensive attack, designed to create the impression of a man whose judgment was failing, whose behavior was becoming paranoid and antisocial. In a court proceeding, it might be persuasive, especially if delivered by concerned family members and supported by professional testimony. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd revealed their strategy while standing in my living room, surrounded by cameras that were recording every word. "Let me make sure I understand," I said, rising from my chair and walking to the mantel where Caroline's photograph looked out at the gathering. "You believe I'm mentally incompetent because I refuse to let you use my house as a wedding venue. You think I need supervision because I've consulted an attorney about protecting my own assets. You consider it erratic behavior when I install security equipment after family members begin making unauthorized inquiries about my financial affairs." I turned to face them, keeping my voice steady and reasonable. "Dr. Kellerman, as a professional, would you consider those behaviors evidence of diminished capacity? Or would you consider them rational responses to attempted manipulation and control?" Dr. Kellerman looked uncomfortable for the first time since arriving. She glanced at Ethan, then back at me, clearly recognizing that the situation was more complex than she'd been led to believe. "Mr. Dalton, family dynamics can be complicated." "They're not complicated here," I interrupted. "They're quite simple. My son and his family want control of my property and my decisions. I've refused to give them that control. Now they're attempting to have me declared incompetent so they can take it anyway." The room fell silent, except for the soft ticking of Caroline's grandmother's clock on the side table. Even that sound seemed to emphasize the weight of what had been said and couldn't be taken back. Finally, Gerald broke the silence. "Richard, if that's really what you think, then maybe this conversation is over." "It was over before it started, Gerald. The only question was whether you were going to be honest about your intentions or keep hiding behind concern for my well-being." They left in the same formation they'd arrived in, but with less confidence and more haste. Dr. Kellerman paused at the door, looking back at me with what might have been professional curiosity or personal regret. "Mr. Dalton, if you ever want to talk, privately, without family involvement, you have my card." After they'd gone, I sat in the sudden quiet of my living room and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete clarity about who I was and what I was fighting for. The boy I'd raised, the man I'd hoped Ethan would become, was gone, replaced by someone who viewed my independence as an obstacle to his convenience and my attachment to Caroline's memory as a barrier to his plans. But I wasn't broken. I wasn't confused. And I sure as hell wasn't going to be managed by people who measured my worth by my willingness to accommodate their demands. I picked up my phone and called Marcus Henley's emergency number. When he answered, I could hear family voices in the background. Sunday dinner, probably, the kind of normal family gathering that had once been routine in this house. "Marcus, it's Richard Dalton. They just left. All of them, including a geriatric counselor they brought to assess my competency. It's all recorded. How do you feel?" I looked around the living room, at Caroline's carefully chosen furniture, at the photographs that chronicled our life together, at the windows that looked out on the garden she'd planted with such hope and care. "I feel ready for whatever comes next," I said, "and I feel like it's time to show them exactly what they're dealing with." Tomorrow, I would begin the final phase of this battle. Tonight, I would sit in Caroline's chair and plan the kind of defense she would have been proud of. Strategic, uncompromising, and absolutely devastating to anyone who tried to take what wasn't theirs. The war had begun in earnest, and I intended to win it. Monday morning arrived with the kind of bitter clarity that follows a sleepless night spent making irrevocable decisions. I'd reviewed the security footage from yesterday's confrontation 3 times, taking notes on body language, recording exact quotes, documenting the coordinated nature of their assault on my competency. By dawn, I had a complete record of what amounted to a conspiracy to strip me of my autonomy. More importantly, I had a plan. Dr. Morse's office was busy with the usual Monday morning crowd, elderly patients dealing with chronic conditions, worried spouses accompanying their partners, the familiar rhythm of medical maintenance that becomes routine after 70. I'd been coming here for 15 years, first with Caroline, then alone, and the staff knew me as a reliable patient who paid his bills on time and followed medical advice without drama. "Richard," Dr. Patricia Morse said as she entered the examination room, "I understand you need a comprehensive evaluation. Is everything all right?" Patricia was my age, maybe a year younger, with the kind of competent manner that inspired confidence without being overly warm. She'd guided Caroline and me through various health crises over the years, always with honesty tempered by compassion. "Family concerns," I said, which was becoming my standard shorthand for this situation. My son and his in-laws seem to think I'm not managing well on my own. I need current documentation that I'm mentally and physically competent to make my own decisions." Her expression sharpened with understanding. "Ah, adult children questioning parental capacity. I see more of that than I'd like to admit." The examination was thorough. Blood pressure, heart rate, reflexes, cognitive function tests, memory assessments. Dr. Morse asked detailed questions about my daily routine, my social interactions, my ability to manage finances and household tasks. She tested my recall of recent events, my understanding of current affairs, my ability to perform simple calculations. "Richard," she said finally, setting down her clipboard, "your physical health is excellent for a man your age. Your cognitive function shows no signs of impairment. Your recall is sharp, your judgment appears sound, and your emotional responses are appropriate to your circumstances." She leaned back in her chair, studying me with the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had more to say. "Off the record, may I ask what specific concerns your family has raised?" I told her about Sunday's ambush, about the geriatric counselor they'd brought without my knowledge, about their suggestions that my desire to preserve Caroline's memory was somehow pathological. "Let me be very clear about something," Dr. Morse said when I finished. "Grief doesn't have a timetable, and preserving a spouse's memory through maintaining shared spaces isn't unusual or unhealthy. What is concerning is when family members pathologize normal grief responses because those responses interfere with their own plans." She pulled out her prescription pad and began writing. "I'm going to give you copies of today's evaluation, along with a formal letter stating my professional opinion about your mental competency. If your family continues to question your capacity, suggest they arrange for an independent psychological evaluation. Any qualified professional should reach the same conclusions I have." By noon, I had official medical documentation of my competency, along with Dr. Morse's written opinion that my behavior showed no signs of diminished capacity or impaired judgment. Armed with these documents, I drove directly to Marcus Henley's office. "They brought a professional to evaluate you without your consent?" Marcus asked after I'd described Sunday's confrontation. "Dr. Sarah Kellerman, geriatric counselor, she seemed surprised that I was aware of what they were trying to do." Marcus was already reaching for his phone. "I'm going to contact Dr. Kellerman directly. If she's planning to provide any documentation about yesterday's meeting, I want to ensure she understands the legal context. What they did, bringing a professional evaluator under false pretenses, could actually work in our favor if they try to pursue guardianship proceedings." While Marcus made his calls, I reviewed the trust documents one more time. The house was now legally protected, but I was beginning to realize that legal protection might not be enough. Ethan and his family had escalated their campaign precisely because they believed I was isolated and vulnerable. They saw an elderly widower with no one to turn to for support. It was time to show them how wrong they were. That afternoon, I began making calls to people I hadn't spoken with in months. Robert Carson, my neighbor who had helped me repair storm damage last spring. Janet Morrison from the bank, who'd known Caroline and me as a couple. Bill Hastings, who had installed my security system. Dr. Morse's nurse practitioner, who had worked with Caroline during her final illness. I wasn't asking for help, not yet. I was simply reestablishing connections, reminding people that I existed as more than just a lonely old man rattling around in an empty house. Each conversation was brief and natural, but each one also served notice that I had a community, people who knew me well enough to judge my mental state accurately. The responses were uniformly supportive. Robert immediately offered to provide character testimony if needed. Janet mentioned that she'd been concerned about the nature of Ethan's inquiries at the bank. Bill expressed outrage that family members were questioning my judgment. Dr. Morse's office volunteered to provide additional medical documentation if requested. By evening, I had assembled what Marcus called a competency support network, professionals and friends who could testify to my mental acuity, my responsible behavior, my appropriate emotional responses to my circumstances. If Ethan wanted to challenge my capacity, he'd have to overcome testimony from multiple credible witnesses. The phone rang just as I was reviewing my notes from the day's conversations. Ethan's voice, tighter with frustration than I'd ever heard it. "Dad, Dr. Kellerman called me this afternoon. She said you've been contacting people, building some kind of case against your own family. I've been talking to friends and professionals who know me well, people who can provide accurate assessments of my mental state if needed. This is getting ridiculous. We bring in a professional to help with family communication, and you turn it into some kind of conspiracy theory. You brought in a professional to document my supposed incompetency without my knowledge or consent. There's a difference. Fine, Ethan said, his voice shifting to the cold tilt I was learning to recognize as his final position. If that's how you want to play this, we're prepared to take more formal steps. What kind of steps? The kind that will ensure you get the supervision and care you clearly need, whether you want it or not. The line went dead, leaving me with the unmistakable sound of a declaration of war. Ethan had moved beyond manipulation and pressure tactics. He was threatening direct legal action to strip me of my autonomy. I sat in the sudden quiet of my kitchen and felt something crystallize inside me. Not anger exactly, but a cold determination that came from finally understanding exactly what I was facing. This wasn't a family dispute that could be resolved through compromise or communication. This was an attempted coup, and it required the kind of response that would end the threat permanently. I called Marcus at home. They're planning to file for guardianship, I told him. Ethan just threatened formal steps to ensure I get supervision whether I want it or not. How quickly can we move on the defensive measures we discussed? The trust is already established, the medical documentation is complete, and I've got character witnesses lined up. But, Marcus, I don't want to just defend against their attack. I want to make sure they never try this again. There was a pause while Marcus considered the implications. What exactly are you proposing? I looked around the kitchen where Caroline and I had shared 37 years of morning coffee, where we'd planned our days and dreamed about our future, where I now sat alone but no longer helpless. I'm proposing we make it clear that attacking my competency was the worst mistake they could have made. I want them to understand that there are consequences for treating family like enemies. Richard, I have to ask, are you certain about this? Once we take aggressive action, there's no going back to normal family relationships. I thought about Ethan's casual assumption that my house would eventually be his, about Madison's suggestions for updating Caroline's carefully chosen decor, about Gerald's calculations regarding my property values, about Patricia's dismissal of my grief as unhealthy attachment. Marcus, there are no normal family relationships left to preserve. These people see me as an obstacle to their plans, not as a father and father-in-law deserving of respect. It's time they learn the cost of that mistake. We spent the next hour planning what Marcus called comprehensive protective action. Beyond the defensive measures we'd already taken, we would file formal complaints about the unauthorized medical evaluation, document the pattern of harassment and manipulation, and prepare counter-strategies that would make any guardianship petition extremely difficult to pursue. More importantly, we would send a clear message that I wasn't the vulnerable target they'd assumed me to be. Tuesday morning, I woke with the kind of focused energy I hadn't felt since my construction days, when complex projects required coordination of multiple contractors and careful timing of sequential tasks. I had work to do, and for the first time in months, that work felt meaningful. The first call was to my accountant, reviewing financial records that demonstrated responsible management of assets and income. The second was to my insurance agent, updating policies to ensure maximum protection for the house and its contents. The third was to a private investigator Marcus had recommended, arranging for background checks on Gerald and Patricia Monroe. Why the in-laws? Marcus had asked when I'd suggested this step. Because people who are willing to manipulate one elderly person have probably done it before. If they have a pattern of this behavior, we need to know about it. By noon, I had set in motion a comprehensive investigation of everyone who'd participated in Sunday's ambush. Financial records, professional licenses, previous legal disputes, anything that might reveal patterns of predatory behavior toward elderly family members. The security system recorded 2 more surveillance passes by the dark sedan, now clearly identifiable as a rental car. Someone was still watching the house, probably hoping to document erratic behavior or signs of decline. Let them watch. Everything I was doing was methodical, rational, and completely legal. That evening, as I sat in Caroline's chair reviewing the day's progress, I felt her presence more strongly than I had since the funeral. Not as memory or wishful thinking, but as active partnership. She would have fought just as hard to protect what we'd built together. She would have been proud of the way I was refusing to be intimidated or manipulated. The phone rang one final time, just as the grandfather clock chimed 9. Madison's voice. no longer pretending warmth or concern. "Richard, this has gone far enough. We know you've been conducting some kind of investigation, hiring professionals, building a case against your own family. This isn't normal behavior for a grieving widower. It's the behavior of someone who's lost perspective. Madison, let me help you understand something. Normal behavior for a grieving widower is protecting his wife's memory and preserving what they built together. Normal behavior is refusing to be pushed around by people who want to profit from his vulnerability. Normal behavior is fighting back when attacked. We're not attacking you, we're trying to help you." "No," I said, looking up at Caroline's photograph on the mantel, seeing her smile, and remembering the strength that had carried us through 37 years of marriage. "You're trying to help yourselves, and you're about to learn why that was a mistake." I hung up and unplugged the phone, cutting off their ability to continue the harassment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight I would sleep peacefully in the house Caroline and I had made our sanctuary, because tomorrow they would discover that the elderly widower they'd thought was an easy target had become something much more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose and everything still worth fighting for. The war was far from over, but the balance of power had just shifted dramatically in my favor. 3 weeks later, the morning arrived with the kind of crisp finality that October reserves for its last act. I stood at the kitchen window, watching frost sparkle on Caroline's chrysanthemums, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the hollow quiet of an empty house, but the deep satisfaction that comes from work completed and battles won. The package from Marcus Henley's office had arrived the previous afternoon. Thick manila envelopes containing documents that would ensure my autonomy for whatever years remained. But it was the smaller envelope, marked personal and confidential, that had brought this morning's sense of completion. Inside were photocopies of legal papers filed in Phoenix County, Arizona, 3 years earlier. Gerald Monroe, petitioner, seeking guardianship of his then 81-year-old father-in-law, citing diminished capacity and inability to manage financial affairs. Patricia Monroe listed as proposed guardian, with authority over a estate valued at just over $2 million. The petition had been successful. Marcus's private investigator had been thorough. Gerald and Patricia had a pattern, identifying elderly relatives with substantial assets, establishing concern about their capacity to manage affairs independently, then maneuvering themselves into positions of control. The Arizona case had netted them a lakefront property in Scottsdale and a portfolio of municipal bonds. The elderly man had died in a care facility 18 months later, never having returned to the home he'd occupied for 47 years. "Textbook elder abuse," Marcus had written in his accompanying note. "They are professionals at this, which makes your resistance even more important. And your victory even more complete." Victory. The word felt strange applied to a conflict with my own son, but it was accurate. The formal guardianship petition Ethan had filed 2 weeks earlier had been dismissed within days, after the court reviewed my medical evaluations, competency assessments, and testimony from multiple character witnesses. Dr. Kellerman, contacted by Marcus, had submitted a clarifying report stating that our Sunday meeting had provided no evidence of diminished capacity and that she'd been misled about the nature of the consultation. More damaging to their case was the revelation of Gerald and Patricia's history. Judge Margaret Thornton had made it clear that the court looked unfavorably on families with documented patterns of exploiting elderly relatives, particularly when those families were supported by adult children with obvious financial motivations. The dismissal had been swift and absolute, but the real victory had come 3 days later when Ethan called for the last time. "Dad," his voice had carried none of its usual calculation, just exhausted defeat. "We're moving to Phoenix. Gerald found a job there, and Madison thinks the change will be good for everyone. I see. I want you to know that we never meant for things to get so complicated. We thought we were helping." I'd listened to this final attempt at rationalization with something approaching pity. Even now, facing the complete failure of his schemes, Ethan couldn't bring himself to acknowledge what he had actually tried to do. "Ethan," I'd said quietly, "helping means asking what someone needs and respecting their answer. What you did was decide what I needed and then try to force me to accept it. There's a difference." The silence that followed had stretched long enough that I'd wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice had sounded very young. "I loved her too, you know. Mom, I miss her too. I know you did, but missing someone doesn't give you the right to erase the life they helped create. I know that now. It was as close to an apology as I was likely to receive, and perhaps as much as I could reasonably expect from a man who'd spent weeks trying to have me declared incompetent. Take care of yourself, Ethan, and take care of Madison. Dad, would it be all right if I called sometimes? Not about the house or any of this other stuff, just to talk. I'd looked around the kitchen, at Caroline's coffee cup still waiting in the cabinet, at her reading glasses still folded on the counter, at the carefully preserved evidence of a life lived with intention and love. Call in a year, I had said finally, after you've had time to think about who you want to be and what kind of relationship you want to have with your father. If that person is someone who respects boundaries and treats family with dignity, we'll talk. The line had gone quiet, then dead. 3 days later, the moving trucks had arrived at Ethan's house. By week's end, they were gone. Now, standing in the morning light of my kitchen, I felt the weight of their absence not as loss, but as liberation. The house no longer felt like territory under siege. It felt, once again, like home. I poured coffee into Caroline's favorite mug, the blue ceramic one with the chip she'd refused to discard, and carried it to her reading chair. The morning newspaper lay unread on the side table. Current events felt less urgent when you'd successfully defended your right to determine the terms of your own life. Instead, I sat quietly in the chair where she'd spent thousands of evenings, feeling her presence not as memory, but as ongoing partnership. We'd built this life together, this house, this sanctuary. I'd preserved it for both of us, and in doing so, had discovered that I was stronger than either of us had probably realized. The doorbell rang just after 9 o'clock. Through the security system, I saw a familiar figure on the porch, Dr. Patricia Morse, holding what appeared to be a covered dish. "Patricia," I said, opening the door, "this is unexpected. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, Richard. I brought soup, that vegetable barley recipe Caroline always asked for when you were both fighting colds." I invited her in, touched by the gesture and the memory it represented. We sat in the living room, where she admired Caroline's arrangement of family photographs, commented on how well I was maintaining the house, and asked thoughtful questions about how I was adjusting to life alone. "You seem different," she said finally. "More settled, less burdened. I feel different, like I've remembered who I am apart from being half of a couple. And who is that?" I considered the question, looking around the room that Caroline had decorated with such care, and that I'd fought so hard to preserve. Someone who builds things that last. Someone who protects what matters. Someone who doesn't back down when pushed around by people who mistake kindness for weakness. Dr. Morse smiled. Caroline would be proud. After she left, I spent the afternoon in my workshop, a space behind the garage where I'd always gone to think and plan and work with my hands. The tools hung exactly where I'd left them months ago, waiting patiently for projects that had been delayed by grief and family crisis. Today felt like the right day to begin building again. I pulled out the plans Caroline and I had discussed during her final winter. A gazebo for the back garden, positioned to take advantage of both morning and evening light, sized for 2 people to sit comfortably and watch the seasons change. She'd sketched it on graph paper during one of her good days, calculating proportions and angles with the mathematical precision that had always surprised people who knew her only as an artist and gardener. By late afternoon, I had the materials list completed and the construction timeline roughed out. It would be a complex project for a man my age working alone, but I had time now. Time and purpose and the kind of focused energy that comes from having successfully defended everything you hold dear. The phone rang as I was cleaning up the workbench. Not the landline I'd kept disconnected since that final conversation with Madison, but my cell phone, which only a few people had the number for. "Mr. Dalton, this is Sarah Kellerman. I hope you remember me." The geriatric counselor they had brought to evaluate my competency. I remembered her very well. "Dr. Kellerman, what can I do for you?" I wanted to apologize for the circumstances of our meeting. I was given incomplete information about the family dynamics, and I realized now that I was used in a way that compromised my professional ethics. Apology accepted. I also wanted you to know that I've reported the incident to the appropriate professional boards. What your family attempted, using a healthcare professional to build a case for incompetency without the subject's informed consent, violates several ethical guidelines. It won't happen to anyone else. After we hung up, I sat in the gathering dusk of my workshop and felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Not only had I defeated their attempt to control my life, but I'd helped ensure they couldn't victimize other elderly people the same way. Caroline would have approved of that too. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since the funeral. I opened a bottle of wine, a good Bordeaux we'd been saving for our 40th anniversary, and carried a glass out to the back garden. The chrysanthemums glowed in the last light of day, their deep burgundy and gold exactly the colors Caroline had planned for this time of year. I sat on the stone bench we'd installed together 15 years ago, raised my glass to the garden she'd created, and spoke aloud to the woman who'd made all of this possible. We did it, Caroline. We kept our home. We kept our dignity. We kept faith with everything we built together. The evening air carried the scent of wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace, the sound of geese calling as they passed overhead, the rustle of leaves beginning their final transformation. Normal sounds of a normal autumn evening in a house that was truly mine again. Tomorrow I would begin building the gazebo, creating something new in the garden Caroline had planted. Next week, I would call Robert Carson about helping with the foundation work. It felt good to have projects that required cooperation rather than defense. Next month, maybe, I would think about the holidays and whether I wanted to invite anyone to share them. But tonight, I simply sat in the garden of the house I'd successfully defended, drinking wine chosen by the woman I'd loved for 37 years, watching stars appear in the clear October sky. The war was over. The victory was complete. And for the first time since Caroline's death, I felt genuinely excited about whatever came next, because whatever it would be my choice to make in my own home on my own terms. And that, I realized, was all I'd ever really wanted. The grandfather clock in the house chimed 10 times, marking another day in a life that was fully, indisputably, and legally mine. I finished the wine, collected the glass, and walked back toward the house that had been worth fighting for. Behind me, Caroline's garden settled into peaceful darkness. Ahead of me, the lights of home waited warm and welcoming. I was exactly where I belonged,